the beginning that you have made me.
Jonathan Rosen's interest in Jewish themes is evident in his books, among them The Talmud and the Internet and Eve's Apple, and is expressed even more prominently in the recent series of books he edited, which brings in modern thinkers to write about figures from Jewish history.
We had a doctor, a very eminent medical historian, Sherwin Newland, who wrote a book that in the United States was a large bestseller called How We Die, about how people die. And I asked him to write about Maimonides, the patron saint of Jewish doctors, to see what did this man who died 800 years ago have to say to Dr. Newland, and what is it about the law, the body of the law, that is like a human body, the imperfect body that Jews somehow make their peace with. And it's that encounter, that back and forth, that gives the book its excitement, and a lot of readers are themselves scared of Jewish subjects. Everybody has a moment of panic because they feel, who am I? Judaism is very good at making people feel inadequate in the face of the tradition, which indeed can be crushing. And so my job is partly to coax them and say, actually, who if not you? Because if Maimonides is lost to you, he's lost to the majority of American Jews, but maybe even in a larger sense, Jews, because the problem is most writers, people who are called Jewish writers, are not really necessarily Jewishly, culturally literate. We call them Jewish writers, but they're really more like Philip Roth. For them, Ellis Island, the place of entrance for American immigrants, is like Mount Sinai, and everything from there is the beginning.
But actually, just making this analogy is very Jewish.
Yes, absolutely. But the people who are steeped in Jewish learning often are not so connected to culture and literature, and the people who are steeped in culture and literature are not so steeped in Jewish learning. So the idea is to get them from different directions to have an encounter.
Is this what appeals to you in Judaism? Is this constant transition between points of view?
I'm interested in living between worlds. I wrote a book called The Talmud and the Internet, and the question really was, how do you reconcile this world of ancient religious impulses and modern secular technological impulses? And the fragmentary nature of the Internet is not so different from the hyperlinks of a page of Talmud, and we're all trying to find ourselves in the midst of brokenness. And so shuttling between those worlds is where I find myself.
So what is this new world that Judaism is flexing itself into now?
It's interesting. I don't know that I have a good answer for it, but I think that this idea, Herzl's idea of Alt Neuland, actually is a wonderful metaphor for many, many things. I worked at a newspaper called The Forward, which for 100 years was a Yiddish immigrant newspaper. I was part of the recreation of that paper into English. My father, who was born in Vienna, always called it the Alt Neu paper because it had a history, an old history. At the same time, it was being recreated. And I'd like to think, the immigrant journey in America was the journey out, away from Judaism, away from the shtetl. My generation, the journey back seems just as exhilarating in its own way, and so I'm interested, I suppose, that there's something new being born that is neither old nor new. It's Alt Neu culture. I think that there's an aspect of the move to recovery which is, in its klezmer emphasis, and perhaps in its Yiddish emphasis, actually at odds, in some sense, with Zionism. I wish it were not the case. I don't see why we cannot now, after the Shoah, reconcile these elements. There is a dimension of people who reject Hebrew because it's the autonomous language of force and autonomy and power, and they see Yiddish as safe because it belongs now to the world of the dead. But I wrote a novel about a woman who's anorexic. I'm very interested in what I would call political anorexia, discomfort with Israel, which is, in some sense, the body of the Jewish people. It takes up space, it has borders, it has appetites, it has aggression, it has all sorts of impulses, and accepting it is a form of psychological and physiological wholeness. So we spent 2,000 years, in some sense, in a disembodied realm, which, of course, Jews lived their actual earthbound lives, but a lot of Jews made a cult, ultimately, of exile and disembodiment. The Luftmensch was somehow a man who actually lived untethered. And so I'm fascinated by the process of retranslation. I think even after 60 years, Israelis are still translating themselves back into the land. I don't think it's complete. I'm always interested to discover how much there's a slight re-diasporization of elements of Israeli culture. And so I think there too, it is reciprocal. So in a sense, I think Israel embodies the contradictions. It may not articulate them. And when you write a novel, you don't really want to be articulating them. You want to embody them in a believable way. Otherwise, you'd be writing a work of philosophy, which would be a nightmare. You want your characters to be earthbound, believable, and embodied. And that, for me, is a big thing about being a writer. And that's a tension that interests me very much. My last novel ends with the heroes going off to Israel.
So how does one go to a table and write a novel? I mean, what does it take? There's a very famous saying that writing is very simple. All you have to do is concentrate until you start bleeding from your forehead.
Yes, exactly. Different novels germinate in different ways, and sometimes it's a feeling, and sometimes it's a phrase. The first phrase of my last novel, Joy Comes in the Morning, is someone was dying. I didn't know who was dying or who would die, but it just somehow answering that question became part of the novel. There's no clear pattern. That novel's about a woman rabbi. My wife is a woman rabbi. It's not a biography of her, but her life, the radical newness of being a woman rabbi and the radical ancientness of being a rabbi and of being a woman, exactly, allowed the contradictory elements of something new to really take hold in me, and somehow it kind of took off from there in a way.
Is Judaism a good story?
Judaism is the greatest story. And indeed, the Bible begins in the beginning, which is essentially once upon a time in biblical language. We are born out of stories. And I'm fascinated by that too, that it's really losing our imagination. That's the thing that frightens me the most.
Do you see a decrease in imagination in the Jewish world?
Well, I'm not sure if I see a decrease. I just know that more than ever, I think it's incredibly vital. We need to have an imagination for disaster, or we are doomed. And we need to have an imagination for new possibility, or we are doomed. Both those things gave birth to the State of Israel. The understanding that Jews would be doomed in Europe, and also that it would be possible to make something new. In America, of course, it's very easy to be a Jewish writer because you participate in the larger whole in America, not by leaving your particularity aside, but through your individual particularity. The United States of America, it's got a weird plural singular title, the United States. I actually think that the embrace of the particular as the root to the large and universal is very, very present, and everyone's obsessed with the Israeli story, with the Jewish story, because it's the great narrative. Everyone else is bound up with it, and what's more, we were cast as villains in somebody else's narrative, and writing itself goes against that role, just like the creation of the State of Israel went against that role. You rejected the definition that was thrust upon you to be a villain, in the longest running play in history, whether it's Shylock or whether it's being those who killed Jesus. And so, in a sense,
you write in self-defense.
You write in self-defense, but you also write to extend the narrative. And I think many things turn out to be literary problems that look like other forms of problems.